Okay, so the last time we started to discuss so-called dispositional domain. The main idea of personality psychologists in this domain is about studying dispositions, which is not surprising. So dispositions understood as relatively stable traits of personality, which we can identify, measure, and study. Thus, we can compare people based on the traits they have. So we discuss different theoretical aspects of classifying those and identifying those traits. And in this lecture, we will discuss exact taxonomies or classifications of personality traits, which are the most famous in personality psychology. So again, taxonomy is a scientific process of classifying things, just a fancy word for classification, and which are the most influential taxonomies of personality in personality psychology. So today we will discuss hierarchical model of personality by Hans Eysenck, circumplex taxonomies of personality created by Timothy Leary and Jerry Wiggins, the five-factor model, or Big Five, one of the most famous and influential models in personality psychology. The HEXACO model, it's a revision of Big Five model done by Canadian psychologist. And finally, we will talk about the Dark Triad. So let's start with hierarchical model of personality created by Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck is one of the most famous psychologists of 20th century. So I suppose we need to discuss his biography first. So his mother was a film star and father was an actor. So he was born in unusual family because his parents had quite a creative occupation. So Isaac was brought up by his grandmother Zoo because his parents were constantly at work. And which is unusual about his grandmother, that she had a Jewish ancestry but converted to Catholicism, which is quite rare. Unfortunately, she died in concentration camp. So the problem was that their family lived in Germany in the times when Adolf Hitler came up to power. So they were forced to immigrate to England in 1930s. I remind you that Hitler usurped the power in Germany in 1933, so when Hans Eysenck was 17 years old. So he was the founding editor of International Journal of Personality and Individual Differences and wrote around 80 books and 1,600 journal articles. So it's an absolutely astonishing number of publications, which few of other psychologists, historically speaking, had. So it's an amazing scientific productivity in his writing. So Eysenck was also controversial because of his beliefs. For example, Eysenck believes that IQ scores connected with genetics and heritability and genetically influenced by biological race. And Heinz Jürgen Eysenck has a reputation of being a racist. So scholars also identified errors and suspected data manipulation in Eysenck's articles and works. So he also was involved with several scandals connected with academic integrity and honesty, so which also spoiled his reputation. He died from brain tumor in the age of 81 years old. So Hans-Jürgen Eysenck at the same time is, very controversial figure because of his ethical beliefs, but still very productive scientist. So we need to assess his legacy and his theories very carefully, trying to distinguish his personal dubious views from scientific facts. So what was his ideas? His hierarchical model of personality is also often called PEN model, easy to memorize acronym. So I think supposed that we should create taxonomy of personality traits on the foundation that the most important traits are highly heritable and have psychophysiological foundation. So it was his idea for classification. We need to find those personality traits which are highly heritable and have a psychophysiological basis. In this case, we can consider those traits as the most important, and other traits which are less heritable and have no physiological basis, less important. So according to Eysenck, there are three such traits which he supposed meet those criteria. It's extroversion, introversion, second, neuroticism, emotional stability, and third, psychoticism. So we will discuss each facet in more detail in next minutes. Now we just need to learn that it's easy to remember by PEN acronym. So psychoticism, extroversion, neuroticism as the three main personality traits. So I think try to explain the difference between behavior and personality traits. So according to Eysenck, they create some form of a pyramid. At the bottom of this pyramid lies specific acts of behavior. You just did something, for example, you drink tea, right? Or you sit on a chair or do something. It doesn't tell anything about your personality because it's just very specific, sometimes random acts of behavior. But your behavior also can be habitual. So we all have some habits to see it somewhere, to spend our time, for example, reading instead of watching movies, or going for hiking or other activities. So all people have different habits how to spend their spare time or eat something, or how they communicate and with whom and so on. So it's the third level of this hierarchy. According to Eysenck, clusters or big chunks of habitual acts become so-called narrow traits of personality. So the idea is that if we combine several habits you have, they create already personality trait, which makes it more stable over time and more consistent over different situations, which meets the criteria of being a trait. And finally, he supposed that if we combine several narrow traits together in a cluster, again, a big chunk, it creates so-called super traits. So there are only three super traits in this classification. Again, psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. So they are on the top of this hierarchy. So basic idea that the most important super traits, again, depend on heritability and have some physiological substrate or psychophysiological foundation. So according to Eysenck and the data he had back in the time, it was more than 50 years ago, he tried to get as much data on behavioral genetics as he could, trying to identify those highly heritable personality traits. And given the data he had back then, he came to the conclusion he came to. So he supposed that those traits not only connected to genetics, but also has psychophysiological processes behind them, which we can identify. So, for example, they should be connected with your nervous system and how it functions. So, speaking about those three super traits. So the first one is psychoticism. According to Eysenck, it's a super trait which consists of several narrow traits, as we discussed, based on his hierarchy. So it includes qualities such as aggressive, cold, egocentric, impersonal, impulsive, antisocial, unempathetic, tough-minded, but which is really interesting, creative. So according to Hans Eysenck, people who score high on psychoticism have all those negative traits, but according to him, they're more creative at the same time, which is actually a dubious claim, which was criticized later by other psychologists who reviewed Hans Eysenck's theory. But according to Eysenck, he saw a connection between psychoticism and creativity, which again is rather unusual. Neuroticism is opposite pole of emotional stability. So people who score high on neuroticism are more anxious, more depressed. They experience more feeling of guilt or shame, suffer from lower self-esteem and unnecessary tension. They might be more irrational, shy, moody, and emotional. So the main problem is that people who score high on neuroticism get irritated and upset more easily than people who score high on emotional stability. So people with high neuroticism have problems with coping with stress. Any minor inconvenience can bring them a huge discomfort and distress, which results in this like low self-esteem, self-criticism, depression, anxiety, sadness, and guilt feelings. So for them, environment and surroundings should be like more supportive so they can function better. Compared to people who score high on emotional stability, who actually are more tough and they can endure more stress without having all these negative feelings. And finally, extroversion, introversion is connected to communication and the need to communicate with other people and level of activity. So according to Eysenck, extroverts more sociable, active, and assertive. They seek more sensations from outside world, so they try more experiences which brings them like sensations, for example, racing, gambling, jumping with parachute, or like flying on delta plane or something like that. They're more dominant and venturesome, so they're more active, more assertive, prone to leadership, and they want to communicate with other people more often. So introverts, as an opposite pole, they are less sociable. They like to spend more time alone, and they don't seek as much sensations from outside world. So they would prefer like just to sit somewhere quiet, read a book, for example, or just watch Netflix. And I think suppose that they would be less active and less dominant, more submissive, and prone to leadership. Again, it's understanding of extroversion as a combination of sociability and being gregarious and active is not the only view on extroversion, and we will see this difference in understanding of extroversion and introversion in other taxonomies, which we will discuss in this lecture. So what are the limitations of Hans-Jürgen Eysenck's theory? So the first one is that many other personality traits also show moderate or even high irritability. So giving the logical foundation which Eysenck chose, those three traits are not the only possible traits which can be included into this taxonomy if we will revise it given our modern understanding of behavioral genetics and data we have. And the second limitation is that Eysenck, because of that, may have missed some important traits in his taxonomy. So other psychologists, such as Raymond Cattell, Lewis Goldberg, Paul Costa, and Robert McRae, the later one is one of the founders of Big Five taxonomy, criticized Eysenck on this basis and created taxonomies with more traits included, more than 3. Okay, so circumplex taxonomies of personality actually are called like that because circumplex is just a fancy word for circle. So the two most prominent advocates of circular representations of personality were Timothy Leary and Jerry Wiggins. You can see their portraits here on the slide. Both lived in United States of America and developed their circumplex theories in mid second half of 20th century. So what is the idea? So Wiggins started with the lexical assumption or lexical hypothesis, which we discussed in previous lecture. So the idea is that all important individual differences between people are encoded within the natural language, right? We already know this idea. But he decided to create his taxonomy by arguing that trait terms specify different kinds of ways in which individuals differ. One kind of individual difference connected with how people interact and communicate with each other, and it was called interpersonal traits. So other kinds of individual differences can include temperamental difference, character difference, material traits, how you deal with money, attitude, mental traits, and physical traits. So, but his main circumplex model is focused on interpersonal traits. So how people communicate and interact with each other and how they differ on this basis. So here on the slide, you can see this circumplex model. It is built around 2 axes. So vertical axis is dominance, submissiveness, and horizontal axis is hostility, friendliness. So basically, giving those 2 dimensions, we can classify people based on their personality traits and communication. For example, people who score high on dominance and friendliness can be natural leaders or nurturers. So they care about other people, they want to communicate, but they want to lead and control this situation, right? On the opposite pole of hostility and submissiveness, right, there are some distrustful and self-effacing people who don't want to communicate with other people and don't want to take a leadership role or take care of other people, right? So other dimensions can also be described as combination of hostility and dominance make more aggressive leaders, which are focused on criticizing other or self-enhancing, right? Presenting themselves as cool, smart, and criticizing other people, so being better than others. On the other hand, a combination of submissiveness and friendliness can create cooperative but more passive people who expect being led by someone else. So basically, this is the idea of this interpersonal traits classification. So people differ based on their agency and the level of cooperativeness and friendliness, thus creating this circumplex model. Again, circumplex here is just a very fancy word for this round shape model classifying interpersonal traits. So advantages of this model are explicit definition of interpersonal behavior, which is a great advantage because most of other taxonomies of personality do not pay that amount of attention to interpersonal communication. The second one, this model specifies the relationships between each trait and every other trait within the model. So this model is just very clear. And as you can understand, because of this structure of orthogonality, bipolarity. And this model, this circumplex model of Huygens, alerts investigators to gaps in investigations of interpersonal behavior. So it's a good taxonomy, which helped to provide some hypothesis and insight for research in interpersonal behavior, which helped to overcome some gaps psychology had back at the time when Huygens created his model. Unfortunately, as all other taxonomies, circumplex taxonomies of personality have their limitations. So, and the most important limitation is that this interpersonal map is limited by only 2 dimensions. So possibly, when we consider such a complex phenomenon as interpersonal communication, we can distinguish more than 2 facets in this, right? So we can create 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional models. They obviously would be much more complicated, but maybe it's necessary because we consider rather complex phenomena. So, and because there are only 2 dimensions here, maybe we miss some important traits which also connected to interpersonal communication, which makes this circumplex model very limited, unfortunately. So these are the main limitations of circumplex taxonomies of personality. Before we will dive into Big 5 model, I want to tell you about like historical prerequisites of its foundation. So everything started with the works of Gordon Allport. We already discussed his lexical approach in the last lecture. So Gordon Allport is considered to be one of the pioneers of personality psychology, especially in North America. So he was born the youngest of 4 children in a very religious family. His father was a doctor and mother was a teacher. So it was a middle-class family or even upper middle-class family. So at school, he already opened his first business and was the editor of the school newspaper. So Gordon was quite an active child. And following his older brother, he entered prestigious Harvard University in 1915 during the First World War. But he didn't start with studying psychology. Initially, he studied economics and then changed his major. So he personally met with Sigmund Freud during his trip into Europe, which is actually very interesting. And when he returned from Europe, he worked at Harvard University for his entire career, for almost 40 years, and became one of the leading experts in personality psychology. So unfortunately, he died of lung cancer at age 70, so he could live much longer, and this is a tragedy for our personality psychology. So Gordon Allport and his colleague Allport are famous for creating a lexical approach we discussed the last lecture. So they actually took English dictionary and tried to find all the adjectives which describe personality traits, and they found almost 18,000 of words. So it was a huge work, and they didn't stop on that. So they tried to classify those traits, and they created 4 lists of those adjectives: stable traits, which do not change over time much, like secure or intelligent. Temporary states, moods, and activity, like agitated, right? It's about this exact situation, so it's a temporary description of personality. Social evaluations, so they have this component of social evaluation, positive or negative, like charming is good, irritating is bad. And metaphorical, physical, and doubtful terms, which create idioms of like prolific lean or Mr. Smart Pants or something like that. So the terms from the first category, like more permanent traits, consist from 4,500 presumably stable traits, which then were used by Raymond Quetelet in 1940s as a starting point of his research on personality. Because of the limited power of computers at the time, Quetelet could not subject this list to a factor analysis. So he wanted to apply this statistical procedure, but given the amount of data and the amount of personality traits he wanted to study, he lacked computational power to actually calculate everything for a time. So instead, he reduced the list to a smaller set of 171 cluster of groups of traits by eliminating some and lumping together others. So basically, he tried to combine it manually, making it more possible to calculate statistically on the later point of his research. He ended up with a smaller set of 35 clusters of personality traits, so it was more manageable. And Raymond Quetelet also worth mentioning as one of the key figures in personality psychology. He was the first in his family to attend university and already became a very famous, prominent personality psychologist. And which is also interesting, he also changed his major. Initially, he studied physics and chemistry. So he got his PhD in psychology quite early at the age of 24 only. And his supervisor was very famous psychologist and statistician, Charles Spearman. We actually invented Spearman correlation coefficient and factor analysis procedure, right? So he studied from the first hand. In 1937, Edward Thorndike, also very famous North American psychologist, invited him to Columbia University in New York. But Quetelet transferred to Harvard by invitation of Gordon Allport, we discussed earlier. So he had alleged friendships with and accusations as well about possible intellectual respect for white supremacists and neo-Nazis. So unfortunately, Quetelet also involved in this ambiguous ethical situations and was suspected in believing in white supremacy theories, so which is less clear situations compared to Eysenck, but still very troubling. So, and worrying. So co-authored and edited around 60 books and 500 research articles. So it's less than Eysenck, but still it's an astonishing number of publications. And also he contributed a lot into the field of psychological assessment by creating over 30 standardized personality tests. And during his retirement, he lived on Hawaii, one of the American states. So Quetelet is very famous because of creation of 16 personality factors classification. So in 1957, when computers already were much better, he could calculate data and factor analysis much better. And basically, he narrowed down these 4,500 of personality traits into 16 factors, which was already quite a manageable number, or dimensions of personality, such as warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. So he also created the 16 PF inventory, which is called just 16 PF, to measure all those 16 personality traits. So it was a huge, huge work to narrow down everything which Gordon Allport tried to find by applying lexical hypothesis, and Cattell applied statistical approach to this, and which led to the emergence of this 16 personality factors classification. So, and basically, this led to the creation of Big Five theory. So some scientists started to think that 16 factors is a lot. And when they applied 16 personality factors test in different countries, they figured out that this test is not applicable for some countries and cultures. So thus, Raymond Cattell classification is not universal from cultural standpoint. And they started to try to find and identify only those traits which can be considered universal across different countries and culture. So basically, they tried to identify those traits, and they came to the conclusion that maybe there are only 5 factors, which is enough to describe a personality. And those 5 factors might be applicable for all cultures and countries. So they suppose it might be extroversion or surgency, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability. And the last factor has more debates about how to call it: culture, intellect, openness to new experience. So it's the most, the factor which is the most open to interpretation. So this factor structure was subsequently replicated, which is also important. Starting from 1960s, different scientists tried to check, does it work like that? And every time they came to the conclusion that yes, 5-factor model can be applied, and they received similar results in subsequent years, in 80s and 90s and early 20th century. So basically, that's why Big Five is still very popular taxonomy of personality traits, because it has a high replicability. So extroversion, talking about those 5 factors: extroversion or surgency, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, or like the opposite is emotional stability, and openness to new experience. So the 5-factor model has proven by huge number of publications, and this model was replicated in every decade since it was created. So probably they grasped some core personality traits in this classification. So how we can measure those 5 personality traits from this Big Five theory? One way is based on self-ratings of single word trait adjectives. So you just ask, are you talkative? Are you warm? Are you organized, moody, and so on? Another way is based on self-ratings of sentence items such as, my life is fast-paced. It's more typical for personality questionnaires. In addition to measures of big five that are single trait words and items, the most widely used measure is NEO-PR, the neuroticism, extroversion, openness, personality inventory, personality inventory revised. So it's an acronym. What are the problems with the big five model? So, and possible limitations. There are some, problems with interpretation of the fifth factor. So openness to new experience is basically connected to how conservative you are, right? So people naturally differ in the acceptance of new experience. Some people like to try something new. They open to new ideas. They can form new skills and habits, while some people stick to one type of behavior they learned very early. They really dislike new ideas, and they try to consider consistency as a virtue, right? It's not bad, it's not good. Some psychologists suppose that it might be connected with the intelligence levels, with the assumption that people who open to new experience are smarter. It's a dubious claim, so it's not that directly connected, but still there is some disagreement about how to interpret this factor. Is it connected to cultural differences, imagination, or other processes or not? And the major cause for this difference is that different researchers start with different item pools to conduct factor analysis. So basically it causes this difference in interpretations, the procedure of how we measure those traits and which items we give to participants in the research. So some researchers suppose that maybe there are a bit more factors than 5 and propose 6, 7, and more factor models. The expansion of the 5-factor model to the 6-factor HEXACO model is one of the attempts to revise Big 5. And one approach to personality factors beyond the Big 5 has been to explore personality descriptive nouns rather than adjectives. Again, returning to our lexical hypothesis, we know that Gordon Allport and Allport from the beginning started with studying only adjectives which describe personality, but we also know that there are some nouns which describe personality as well. If we will use them, we might get a different results of factor analysis and thus a bit different factors which we can interpret then. So the HEXACO model with these 6 factors was created by Ki-Byung Lee and Michael Ashton from Canada. So they work at Brock University and University of Calgary. They added the 6th factor to the Big 5, and this factor is honesty, humility, or HASH, H. At one end of the honesty, humility factor is like one pole is being honest, sincere, trustworthy, and unselfish, while on the opposite pole is like being greedy, arrogant, self-important, and egoistic, right? So it's about interpersonal communication and a bit of ethical values, so how a person perceived by other people, right? And one more difference is that authors of HEXACO model took anger from the factor of neuroticism and emotional stability and included this in the factor of agreeableness. So they suppose that anger belongs not to the expression of emotionality only, but rather it's connected with how agreeable or competitive you are, with the assumptions that people who are more competitive and they don't like to collaborate with others, more prone to expressing anger in interpersonal communication. So this HEXACO model is interesting and has its evidence. The Big Five model still stays more popular among researchers in the world. So again, 6 factors, so honesty, humility, which we discussed, and 5 factors from Big Five. So they just slightly change the names. So emotionality represents neuroticism and emotional stability, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to new experience. So they change the naming a bit, so they will fit, so the names fits into the acronym of HEXACO. And finally, the Dark Triad. So some psychologists were focused not only on the traits which are universal among different countries or describe positive personality traits, but people also differ from each other based on so-called negative personality traits. And 3 most important negative personality traits, or like dark personality traits, are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So dark triad of personality include Machiavellism is a tendency to be cunning, deceptive, exploitative, and manipulative in interpersonal relationships. So people who score high on Machiavellism usually hide their true intentions and try to use other people as a tools or means to reach their real goals. So they like to manipulate other people and to achieve something they need. So that's why they're deceptive and usually quite closed in the communication. But you never know, do people score high on Machiavellism because they are really good at presenting themselves as a positive and nice people. So some of them very skilled into manipulations in the bad sense of this word. So it's really not obvious when you meet such a person that is this person sincere or manipulative actually. So really hard to track. People who score high on narcissism are usually focused on themselves only, and they seek attention, right? And they want that everybody will praise them. So it's not the same as narcissistic personality disorder. So please pay attention to that. We will consider personality disorders in another lecture connected to clinical psychology in another domain of personality psychology. Here, just it's not the same. Scoring high on narcissism in the Dark Triad, it's not the same as having narcissistic personality disorder. And finally, subclinical psychopathy is a tendency toward high impulsivity and thrill-seeking behavior along with very low empathy. So those people do not feel empathy toward others, as they don't care about emotions of other people. So other people, for them, like material objects, so they don't really care what do they feel. And because they seek new sensations and impressions, and they're impulsive, so they have low self-control, because of that, they often prone to aggressive and antisocial behavior. So they basically do what they want without caring what other people feel, right? So it also should be distinguished from antisocial personality disorder. Again, we will talk about personality disorders in another lecture. So there are different personality inventories which measure those dark triad traits. Though people who score high on 1, 2, or 3 of those traits not often participate in research projects. They're not very interested in that, and they often give deceptive answers to hide their actual personality. So this is one of the very interesting but not universal taxonomies of personality, as you can see, because it includes only 3 traits, which all connected to interpersonal communication and ethical values of people. In next lectures, we will continue discussing dispositional domain topics. So see you next time.